Thanks for checking out the Digital Native Podcast. My name's Ryan Anderson, your host. Today, I'm excited to introduce today's guest. He's the founder of the tech blog, The Silicon Florist, the founder of the Portland Incubator Experiment. He's been called the godfather of the Portland startup ecosystem, and he's a connector of dots. That's Rick Turoczy.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining, Rick. First off, how you been holding up during the pandemic?
Been doing okay. We had a big event planned for mid-March, and so we were monitoring the situation a lot more closely than many folks were, given the timing of that. So, I've been in self-isolation for a while now, and have kind of fallen into a pattern. There's still some, obviously, frustrations and things that are more stressful than they need to be, but for the most part, everything's going well. And it's given me the opportunity to kick off some projects for Pi that have been kind of in the wings that we should have been working on anyway. So there's been a kind of silver lining to some of it as well.
Well, that's great. Now I want to talk about Pi today. Also want to give a shout out to your YouTube channel. Some of the stuff, the interviews that you've been giving with some really interesting founders, technology leaders. But today I'm excited to talk about you, your background, and some more of your story.
Sure.
Can you start out, I guess, by telling us a bit more about how did you end up in Portland and how did you kind of become involved in this whole technology and startup ecosystem?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's all just a series of random happy accidents. There's no plan to it whatsoever. So I kind of I was an Army brat, grew up all over, wound up going to college in southeastern Washington in Walla Walla. And I'd always been a dumb jock. I played soccer and lacrosse in college and spent a lot of time around Portland and in Oregon because those were the colleges we were playing against. And so really kind of fell in love with what was a very gritty Portland back in those days. I mean, that was at a time when really the only neighborhoods here in town were kind of like Hawthorne, and then Northwest was kind of starting to become a neighborhood, like Roses was still there and with the pies and everything. So I decided to move here because I just really liked the town. I'd always lived in either very small towns or very large metropolitan areas. And this was a nice balance of the two. It had a very robust culture and yet a very kind of small town feel to it at the time. And I found that attractive. So moved here, had no idea what I was going to do. I'd been working in book publishing, so representing authors and helping them get their books published. And I'd been a nanny and a lacrosse coach and that kind of thing. And just saw a want ad for a very small agency that needed a writer and editor. And I'd been an English major. So I applied for that, got that gig, wound up also being the head of IT for that agency. And that agency was doing work with a lot of early stage startups at that point in time. So tech startups. Back then it was still installed like floppy disk CD installed kind of software. But I'd always been a hobbyist developer. And so I was really attracted to doing that kind of work and wound up doing enough work with one of our clients that they were very kind to work with the agency to just hire me away. They were basically like, why are we paying the agency for you to do all this work anyway? Why don't you just come work with us? And so that was a company called Medical Logic. And Medical Logic was one of the first companies to build electronic medical records. So we were trying to convince doctors to stop doing their work on paper and start doing it digitally. And that was right around the time where the very early stages of the dot-com boom were starting to happen. So that company moved away from being an installed software company to a dot-com. And so I got to participate not only in that transition, and I think my title, I originally started just doing PowerPoint decks for like the road shows and the investor meetings, and eventually transitioned into what was basically the first digital marketing manager position that company had ever had, and one of the first kind of digital marketing positions practically anywhere at that point in time. That's when everybody still had a web strategy. You had to come up with the web strategy and the email strategy and all that kind of stuff.
What were the web trends?
Yeah, exactly. Check out web trends every day. And so did that kind of work, kind of bounced around, followed, executives bounce around. And so I'd follow my VP of marketing around, or other people that I'd had the chance to work with, and wound up working at a variety of startups in town for over about a 12-year period. The only one that's still around is Digimarc out in Beaverton, Oregon. And after doing that work for so long, and I was generally in product marketing roles or marketing communications, investor relations kind of roles. So I was usually fairly close to the executive team and fairly close to the founders. And so I thought I knew enough to, I was like, I can probably start a startup. I've been doing this stuff long enough. And so tried a couple companies of my own, and really discovered that I just wasn't, I don't know that I wasn't cut out for it. It's just I didn't enjoy being a founder. Like the things that need to motivate a founder were not motivating to me. I enjoyed dealing with more of the product and or the marketing or the promotion and that kind of thing. And I was less interested in the business aspects of growing a true kind of startup. And it took me a while to figure that out. But once I finally did, I realized that my role in the community wasn't to be a founder leading a company. It was to be the person who was helping other founders achieve what they wanted to achieve. And, if you're looking at time period wise, this is 2005, 2006, somewhere around there. And so there's like TechCrunch, and everybody's reading TechCrunch, and TechCrunch is not writing about anything in the Pacific Northwest. Maybe some Amazon or Microsoft stuff from time to time, but for the most part, pretty Bay Area focused. And I just was like, well, I have this writing, editing background. What if I just started writing about what's happening in Portland, since no one else seems to be doing that? And that was Silicon Florist. And I had been, I'd had a personal blog since the, on pre-blogger. I was, back when you had to write code to actually have a blog, and then wound up moving on to Blogger. And no one had ever read that before, so I was like, oh, I'll write online and it'll just be kind of my own personal journal. But for whatever reason, it just kind of struck a chord with people. I guess people were feeling the same way as me, that Portland needed a little more attention for what was happening here. And so people started reading my blog and started sending me product releases and event announcements and all kinds of stuff like that. And when the mortgage crisis hit, and unfortunately, companies in town had to go through layoffs, like people were sending me like insider stuff on layoffs. And it was super weird, because I'm like, this is just my personal blog. I'm just writing about stuff. I'm not a journalist. Please don't confuse me with a journalist.
It's funny though. I mean, with that journal, I discovered it. I don't know if I've ever told you this. When I was in college, I first discovered it.
Oh, really?
It was when the whole startup thing was starting to get more airtime, and pop culture started to become more popular. And so,
yeah,
I mean, I had found this thing in this, write up on companies that were in my city. And because of that, I just felt this connection to it. And, they call it, there's a certain scientific term they have when you just feel like you connect to somebody. It's called parasocial relationships. I don't know if you heard this, but I would kind of read what you wrote. And for years, I kind of felt like I knew you, and I thought you did. You probably don't remember this, but probably 7-8 years ago, you came and interviewed the executives at a company that I was with. And I was like, oh my God, that's Rick Turoczy. and you left the interview, and I ran out in the hallway, and I was like, hey, Rick, I just want to introduce myself. It was super awkward, but I was like, dude, like, this is Rick. He's at my office. So commend you was awesome. I mean, still is a great blog, and you do a great job with it. So how did that kind of evolve into Pi?
Yeah. So again, another just happy accident. What, I was like, is this blog actually a thing? Like, could this be a business? Should I be treating it as a business? And so I spent probably about 6 months working on what was among the top 3 tech blogs back in the day. It was a blog called Read Write Web. And so it was like TechCrunch, Mashable, Read Write Web. They were the 3 that were always competing for dominance. And it was another one of those situations where I realized that the business of blogging was not something that was terribly motivating for me. It was a lot about like click-through rates and writing headlines that were, you know, clickbaity headlines to get people to show up so that you get better ad revenue. And that just wasn't motivating to me. Like, and so I was kind of looking, I was like, well, Silicon Florist will just be my side project. It'll just be this thing I do and I enjoy it. And I don't care if anybody reads it. It's fun for me to do. And so I was kind of doing that, doing some advising and consulting when this company headquartered here in town called Wieden & Kennedy reached out to me. And if folks don't know the name Wieden & Kennedy, that's not surprising. They kind of keep to the background, but you've probably seen their work. They're a global advertising agency headquartered here. They're the ones who came up with Nike Just Do It. They're the Old Spice guy, the new Colonel Sanders. Like, they do really, really big brand advertising. And they reached out to me because they partially just wanted to kind of pay it forward and give back to the community, and partially because they were curious about the startup community and what they saw growing here. And they were also getting some interest from their existing clients about innovation and startups and that kind of thing. So it seemed like an opportunity. This is about 2008, 2009. And so still in the middle of the mortgage crisis. And so they had an empty retail spot on the first floor of their building. And they're like, what could we do with that thing? What could we do with that space to help the startup community? And so that conversation turned into Pi, and Pi was originally, it's called the Portland Incubator Experiment. We kind of just call it Pi these days. But the original concept there was just co-working space. And it was, you know, still pretty early in the days of co-working. And so we were testing that concept to see if it could fly here in Portland, and wound up just having a bunch of really interesting people in the space. Everyone from, you know, kind of full founding teams of companies, like Airship was in there in the early days. Simple's technical department grew out, the CTO worked out of the space and grew out of there. You know, the original CTO of Kickstarter worked out of there. Bunch of random stuff. The original community manager for Instagram was a Reed alum, and so he knew a few of the other people who worked in the space. So he worked out of Pi for about probably 2 days when the transition from Bourbon to Instagram occurred. And the original conversation was, oh, I'll totally be able to do this from Portland. And then Instagram blew up and he's like, yeah, I have to move to the Bay Area now, so I won't be working here. But, you know, people from Twitter worked out of there. It was just a really interesting, eclectic mix of folks. And that would cause folks visiting in town to show up at the space as well, right? So like, there was a Pinterest engineer in town, and when his team would show up, they'd do hackathons at Pi or whatever. Or when OSCON, which was the big O'Reilly open source conference that was hosted in Portland, when they were in town, we'd host like a Django hackathon or a Python hackathon or those kind of things. So it really started to become more of a community space. And what we were discovering was, at least from our perspective, co-working and community development were a bit at odds with one another. And what I mean by that is, with a co-working space, you are driven by rent and covering the lease and those kind of things. And you wind up renting a desk to whomever can pay for that desk, whether they're interested in developing community or participating in events or any of that kind of stuff. It's a very transactional relationship. And then we were running into a bunch of early stage founders who were awesome people, great community members, but couldn't afford to pay for a desk. And we were like, well, we want the community people in here, not necessarily the people who could pay. So we kind of ditched the co-working model for a while and just kind of did it as this, if you can figure out how to get into Pi, you're welcome to work out of Pi, and ran it that way for a while. And then kind of what we discovered was that while the peer relationships were great, the peer mentoring of founders helping other founders or making introductions to their investors or their advisors, all of that stuff was going great, but there still seemed to be something lacking in terms of kind of expert mentorship. And I had, at the same time I'm seeing this happen with startups, I'd been having a lot of my former coworkers or bosses going, I'd really like to figure out a way to give back to the community, but I don't have the time to arrange like mentoring with a bunch of people, or I don't even know how to engage effectively. And so we went back to Wyden and said, hey, there's this group of people who want to mentor startups, and we have this group of startups in our space who want to be mentored. What if we kind of refactored the program to make that happen? And then like, well, is anybody really doing that? And at the time we could only point to, we're like, well, there's Y Combinator and there's Techstars, and they're two different models of doing this, and we think Portland needs something in between. And so they're like, okay, let's do that. And so we did that for another 3 or 4 years with Wyden. Some of our most notable companies to come out of that time period were Cloudability was in our first accelerator class. Lytics was in our, I believe, our second class. If folks had been in the cloud space for a while, they might remember Orchestrate, which was a distributed database company. Really cool concept, just too early, I think, which was you shouldn't need to figure out what database your data needs to live in. Just give us the data and we'll put it, if it needs to be in Mongo, it'll go into Mongo. If it needs to go somewhere else, it'll go somewhere else. And so after we did that for a while, we decided that, kind of mutual decision between Wyden and us that we'd kind of run the experiment as far as Wyden was interested, but we felt the community still needed something like that. And so we spun it out of WK as a nonprofit entity, and decided that rather than try and franchise or expand like some accelerator models had done, where they'd gone to various cities or partnered with a wide variety of corporations, we decided that we'd rather just focus on Portland and then figure out different flavors of accelerators to help what we saw happening in Portland. So we were originally SaaS, pretty much purely SaaS companies. We continue to work with those companies, obviously love those companies, and that's where my expertise and network tends to be. We have a project with Autodesk, which has a big office here in Portland, that is focused on hardware projects and Internet of Things kind of projects, where we help with everything from manufacturing to circuit board design to all that kind of stuff. And then we've also expanded into traditional consumer products. So food and beverage, apparel and outdoor, beauty, those kind of things, and have worked on that and are still looking for opportunities. Fintech seems to be one that could have potential given both the established bank infrastructure and transactional infrastructure in town, as well as the early stage startups are like Expensify, who has an office here in town. Acorns has an office here in town. Simple is still here. So there seems to be something there that could be compelling. And then services have always been interesting to us as well, because we're a really big agency town, creative services town. And so we think there might be some potential there too in the not too distant future.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of the companies you just mentioned, I've gotten to work with in my role, the Lytics, the Airships, which has been exciting, the Cloudabilities. But let's talk about Portland a bit. I think you have a pretty unique perspective. You talked about the timing of when Pi started and kind of what did the landscape look like at that time? I mean, that was the very, very early days of the cloud. what did it look like then? Who were some of the major players in the Portland startup ecosystem? And how has that evolved over the last decade plus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at that time period, there wasn't a great deal of activity in the like central city urban core, right? Like at that point in time, for people who aren't familiar with Portland, um, we have a very constrained urban core. We have an urban growth boundary that says the city can only get so big. And so a lot of the bigger companies and tech companies in town used to be out in the suburbs. And so and there's a massive Intel installation out in Hillsborough. And so a lot of kind of hardware, software tech tended to be in the suburbs at that point in time. But more people were interested in being in the city, living in the city, not being stuck on a half-hour, 45-minute commute each way every day. And so we saw this growing kind of software startup scene at that point in time. And a lot of that was born out of the open source community here in Portland. So we had a very strong open source community. As I mentioned before, we regularly hosted OSCON here in town and DjangoCon and RubyCon and all that kind of stuff. And we had, really kind of, I don't know dignitaries from the open source community who happen to live in the area too. So like Ward Cunningham, who invented the wiki, lives here in town and mentors for Pi, and other notable people like that happen to live here. So the open source community was strong, and that was really starting to drive this startup activity. But that was also at a time where that created almost a cultural rift. Like I think in this day and age, it's very common for for-profit companies to use open source products as part of their service delivery. But at that point in time, that was really weird. Like you were either open source or you're proprietary, and there wasn't much crossover at that point in time. So we were really looking for a way to support those early ventures that were proprietary solutions that were likely leveraging some open source code or framework or something to build what they were doing. At the same time, that's, for all you kids out there, that's about when the iPhone was released. So we suddenly had this interest in mobile development because there was suddenly a handset that was prevalent and you could kind of code for. In terms of companies that were kind of big back then, that was really the heyday of Jive Software, which was the biggest startup. It wasn't actually founded in Portland, but it was homegrown in that, the founders moved here and built the company here. Web Trends was still a big deal back then in the day before Urchin and eventually Google Analytics. But they were still a big shop here. There were a few other kind of creative software services kind of companies here in town that were still big, but there wasn't really a software startup scene until the advent of the cloud and until people had the ability to spin up really cost-effective instances, leverage open source code or frameworks, and really combine those two to build products that were accessible to more people at a much, much lower cost, and also with much smaller teams. I think that was the other dynamic is, when I started in startups were like hundreds of people. There weren't like, 2 and 3 person teams building a product. Like you needed a room full of engineers, and then you needed another room full of servers, and then you needed like an IT staff to run the servers and help the engineers. So it took a lot of people back then. And if you weren't around during that time, it's hard to understand the impact of both the cloud coming into being at the same time that mobile is becoming a thing. And that just dramatically changed Portland as a whole. And so I think the way Portland people build businesses is generally engineers building tools for other engineers. So they would recognize, like that's where Airship came from. They recognized this issue that push notifications are really hard. that building those from scratch is really hard. And if we build a platform and get it in the hands of enough people that will handle that infrastructure, then that's a business. Or Puppet, which is here in town. Back then they were called Reductive Labs, and the open source project was called Puppet. But the idea that, you know, server configuration is hard. And if you have to run around and configure every single server, that's a waste of time that a machine could easily be doing. So Portland doesn't tend to kind of swing for the fences with consumer facing stuff. We tend to be more the, you know, in the gold rush analogy, we're not the ones panning for gold. We're the ones selling people the pickaxes and the wheelbarrows and that kind of thing. Like, that's more our style of building businesses. And that just kind of continues to hold true. But I think that is also kind of part of that open source culture where it's, you know, we want to deliver the best product possible and help people do the work they want to do. And I think that's also part of kind of Portland's culture of craft, where we really appreciate something that's well made or well built or well designed, or, you know, really good food or really crafty beers. That's something that's a real underpinning of the tech companies here too.
Yeah, and that's great. And you spoke a bit to cloud. You know, that's a big part of my job is I is kind of explaining not necessarily what it is, but what it can do for you. I mean, I drank with Mark Zussman a while back, and
Yeah.
he said to me, he goes, Ryan, he goes, this whole cloud thing, don't you find it all just a little bit boring? I was like, well, Mark, I mean, you know, it's not just like, what do you mean? The servers, the infrastructure? And he's like, yeah, he's like, all that stuff. And I'm like, Mark, it's not what it is. It's what it enables you to do. It's like, look at Netflix. It's changed the game when it comes to video and television. You know, look at Spotify. It's changed the music industry. For me, what's exciting, speaking to Portland, is you look at a company like Lytics, and they're able to compete and win versus really, really big companies, you know, Adobe, Salesforce. I mean, they're beating these companies with a much more nimble, smaller team, you know, because of some of the partnerships that they have and what they're doing to innovate. So back to Portland, you know, I've heard you refer to Portland as one of the most amazing and vibrant startup communities in the US. What makes it so special? What makes it so unique?
I think it's this really interesting combination of every startup community I've ever encountered, be that here or the Bay Area or Omaha, Nebraska, or Berlin, Germany. Every startup community is collaborative. And I think we often reference the collaboration in Portland. I don't think that's necessarily the unique part of Portland. I think it's something we have, and I appreciate it greatly. And like I do in other startup communities, I think the kind of secret sauce that we have is this, you know, for lack of a better term, that just like we embrace weirdness, which means that we don't mind people recreating the wheel with a slight permutation, because that makes that a very special, weird wheel that somebody might like. And so there's this constant encouragement to explore new ideas and chase potential businesses that I don't see in some other communities. You know, in some other communities, there may be a little more cynicism than optimism, where people are more like, you shouldn't do that, or don't try that, or so-and-so already did that, so you shouldn't do that. Whereas the Portland community's reaction seems to be more of the optimistic kind, where it's like, yeah, they tried that before, but it could have been timing. Maybe you should try that again. Or, yes, there are 10 coffee shops within a 1 mile radius, but if you have a different way of doing that coffee, then you should probably start your own coffee shop. And that kind of mentality is, I think, what makes Portland truly unique and vibrant in that regard, because people are inspired and build upon the ideas of others. So the more ideas you have percolating, the more creativity and potential people can see, and that's just inspiring here locally to see that level of activity, and to see the commitment to supporting those local activities. You know, Portland's a really big, like, buy local town and support local town. And I think that's another important part of the dynamic that allows that economy to work. I have to admit, I'm really curious as to how that works in this new abnormal world we're going to be living in. And I'm a little concerned that Portland's culture is going to take a hit in a bad way because of that dynamic, but that remains to be seen. And I think this community is strong enough. It has a vibrant culture that can be resilient and withstand whatever changes come about. But I'm just kind of curious to see how that plays out for our community.
Yeah, no, makes sense. And you spoke to some of the innovation, and I've heard you talk about, Portland's a place that innovates from its food carts to its donuts,
Yeah.
to its, technology startups. Other side of the coin, I've heard you talk a little bit about Portland being very aggressively humble.
Mhm.
Where can Portland improve, in your opinion? And why, I guess, do you think we have this mindset of being very aggressively humble?
Yeah, I don't, and just to kind of unpack that a little bit, when I say aggressively humble, it's Portland consistently is a town where you'll be talking to somebody who looks just like you, and you're having some conversation, and suddenly it'll come out that they're the CEO of a $500 million company here in town, but they don't lead with that, right? They lead with, it's almost kind of like, almost like a European culture where you ask somebody what they do and they respond with their hobbies before they talk about their job. Portland's got a little bit of that dynamic to it as well. And so I find that incredibly charming, but I also find it can be a bit of a hindrance when you are competing with companies or people who are very aggressive about promoting what they're doing, and where you come up against competitors who are not willing to step back, but rather step forward. And so I think, we're figuring it out. We're still, in terms of the timeline, Portland's still a relatively immature startup community. If you look at somewhere like the Bay Area, they've had 6 or 7 generations of startup community to build upon, back to like Fairchild and all that stuff. So we're still figuring it out and growing, and I think we can find a way to make it work. I think it's just we as a community don't match the Bay Area archetype for kind of like heart charging hustlers who are going to like build these startups and promote their way out of any issue that they have. But I also think that there are a lot more communities like ours than there are communities like the Bay Area. And I think the things we learn here and some of the techniques we develop could be beneficial to second tier metropolitan areas around the world. And so I'm really bullish on that kind of finding a happy middle ground between being cocky and being aggressively humble. But if push comes to shove, I'm going to vote for the aggressively humble, because I think that's what makes Portland Portland.
Yeah, it's a fine line. And I want to get more into that a little bit later. I have some questions specific to you and kind of your learning in that area.
Yep.
Before we get there, though, tell me a little bit more about Pi. I mean, how are you guys supporting startups? You gave a couple of examples.
Yeah.
But what does the accelerator program look like in just kind of a nutshell? And then what are 1 or 2 areas that you guys are focused on right now?
Yep. So the accelerator program, if folks are familiar with accelerators, they are traditionally a 3-month program of highly intensive mentorship. Depending on how they like to be run, sometimes they're a virtual environment, sometimes they're everybody sitting together, and that's where Pi started. And then we literally have not done the same thing twice. So the way our program looks today, prior to the pandemic, we had shared workspace where all the founders sat around with one another. We used to invest, we don't invest anymore, but there's no cost to the founder. So they're not giving up any equity, they're not paying tuition. They have to go through an application process to get selected, but there's no out-of-pocket cost for them to participate. And then we basically run Pi as an independent study for each company. And what I mean by that is there's no set curriculum. It's not like, well, next Tuesday we're going to be doing cap tables 101 and everybody needs to show up. It's more talking to the founders and figuring out, like, what are you really struggling with right now? Like, what is the problem that's holding you back? And then based on those conversations, getting those founders connected with mentors who can help them, mentors who they don't fix the problem for you, but they listen and advise on how you might potentially be able to resolve those issues based on their experience. And then it's like, I mean, it's like product development, right? It's just this iterative process. Like once you've squashed that bug, move on to the next one and figure out how to make it work. We do that currently over about a 6-month period, working with founders. And then usually in the typical accelerator world, there's a demo day, which is the end of the class. It's kind of like the graduation where startups get on stage, they tell the story about the startup they're building, and more often than not, ask for investors to consider providing capital to help them out. We've decided that it's really weird to go through that kind of event or environment and then suddenly not have support from your organization anymore. So this time we've worked the program where demo day is kind of a midway through the program, and then we still work with you for a couple more months to help you figure out what comes next or where you should be going or that kind of thing. So we only run about one program a year. As I mentioned, SaaS has always been a big part of it, SaaS and mobile kind of stuff. The hardware accelerator tends to be earlier stage companies. So folks who are just coming out of like prototyping and starting to figure out the business, where the SaaS companies are like, they're pretty close to product market fit if they're not there already, and they're just really ready to accelerate into a market. And then our consumer products class was focused on even later stage companies. These were companies here in Oregon that were recognizable brand names. Like you would see their products on store shelves and you'd be like, oh yeah, I've heard of that company. And yet by and large, the founders still weren't able to pay themselves a living wage because they were pouring everything back into the company. So what we were trying to do there was help them build more definitive business and strategy around that product offering so that they could generate the type of revenue that would make it a more sustainable and resilient company.
Yeah. You often shine light on that topic. You talked about, hey, there's all the glamour of being a startup founder, but I mean, there's a lot of challenges that come with it too. Can you speak to some of those?
Yeah, there's I think the biggest challenge for founders in this day and age, and you touched on it earlier, is being a startup founder is like the rock star of this generation. It's like it's the cool thing that people aspire to doing, and because of that, there's a prevailing mythology around how companies are built. And movies like The Social Network are not helping in that regard, right? That's not really how companies are built. And yet people get into this thinking that that's how you do it. That if I have a good idea, I go on Shark Tank and get $1 million, and then I'm just off to the races and I can pay myself whatever I want and get to work on a thing that I love. And the reality is pretty much exactly the opposite. You hear no 99 times out of 100. The thing that inspired you to start the business, you no longer get to work on that because there's so many other things you have to do as a founder. And you feel this constant stress and pressure and you're so emotionally wrapped up in the business that it's really hard for founders to say no, or it's time to stop, or this isn't going to work. And that's a really hard kind of emotional struggle for folks. So part of the work we're doing at Pi is to really introduce them to that reality as quickly as we possibly can so that they can make an informed decision about whether they even want to be on this path before they waste their life savings or a bunch of time trying to do something that they're not going to enjoy. Let's make sure that they want to be a founder and they understand what they're in for, and also understand that, you know, a very, very slim percentage of companies ever raise venture capital. And the vast majority of companies are built on revenue and customers. And so how do you build a real business? How do you scale it reasonably? And how do you grow it so that it achieves the vision that the founder wants to achieve, and in a way that is sustainable for a human? Like, Pi used to be stress for the sake of stress because we thought that was a motivator to like get people moving faster. And what we discovered was, you know, companies will grow as fast or as slow as they grow based on the market and the timing and what else is happening in the world. And no amount of undue stress you put on a founder is going to change that. You need to support those people in the work they're doing and look for the opportunities that are going to be the time to grow. And so that's always been our kind of focus, because it's really hard. And it took me, you know, at least a couple companies and probably 3 years to figure out that I didn't enjoy being a founder. And if I can help, you know, if our organization can help somebody figure that out in 2 or 3 months, then all the better. And I'll tell you what, like, people who have been through that experience become amazing employees because they recognize how hard it is. They recognize the pressure that the executives are under. They recognize all the weird dynamics at play. And they also recognize what they're good at doing and are able to focus on that and hone in on it for the company rather than trying to juggle everything like they were doing as a founder.
Yeah.
So it's really a positive. In fact, one of the people I always like to reference is Brad Heller. Brad was in our first class, the same class as Cloudability. And this will kind of date both me and Brad, but Brad's company launched on Google Drive back before there was Google Drive. And when the initial thought of Google Drive was it was going to be kind of almost like an app store environment where you'd be like installing things within Google Drive. So they had an application that launched on Google Drive and got, you know, good adoption and stuff, but there wasn't a path forward for that company. So Brad wound up shutting it down. He went to join Cloudability, which was still in Pi at the time, was a significant contributor on the engineering team and helping them build the product and that kind of stuff. Wound up leaving Cloudability with another Cloudability alum to found a company called Reflect here in town that wound up being both a successful fundraising company, but also a successful exit. And they were acquired by Puppet here in town. So, and Brad had come from like Jive. So Brad's got this really interesting trajectory through the community. And, you know, a lot of that may have never happened if we'd always been kind of like this hard charging, like, no, keep the company alive, try and figure out how to make it work, rather than him being able to say, this isn't working, I need to find something else. And we would have missed out on a great opportunity if we'd forced it.
No, it's a great story, and I appreciate you sharing about the empathy. I mean, I often tell folks, everybody should experience working in a restaurant. You know, everybody should experience having a sales job, because you just learn how to treat each other. And I've never thought, hey, you know, try living, you know, the life of a founder for a day or a week.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So other side of the coin, I mean, when you've been doing this as long as you have, you've seen so many companies go through, you know, inception to scaling the company. What are some of the characteristics that you see from companies who end up succeeding, who do really well? You know, what kind of characteristics do the leadership team have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And mine, again, I'll just kind of caveat this with the fact that this is kind of the Pi experience, or my experience with I've seen founders being successful in our program. I think we always say, you know, we probably would have rejected Bill Gates and Steve Jobs from Pi because they just weren't people who would exist well with that environment and within that environment. They seemed very headstrong, knew what they were going to do, and didn't really take other people's opinions about what needed to be done. Our folks, on the other hand, tend to be folks who are capable of taking and assimilating feedback and then making good decisions. So they're coachable kind of folks. Not necessarily that they're following every directive that a mentor provides, but rather they're able to take that in, internalize it, and make good decisions based on their vision. If they're part of a team, there's a deep respect for everyone's roles and responsibilities and where those guardrails exist and who makes decisions about what. Those make for some really good founding teams in our program. Generally, while we've worked with a bunch of solo founders, I would say the most successful teams tend to be an engineering person, a developer, someone who's focused on the business, and then often kind of a third person, which doesn't necessarily have to have a particular skill set. It just needs to be complementary to those other two. So sometimes that could be a marketing or sales person. Sometimes that could be an operations or HR person. It's just somebody to kind of balance out that duo and provide another kind of sounding board for those activities. And then it's, I find it's the people who figure out how to leverage the pie framework to the greatest benefit. So some founders get so busy working on their business that they don't really explore our model, and we don't kind of force our model on anyone. But if you kind of engage and like start questioning things or start asking for things or really open up about what problems you're actually having and having the confidence to share that kind of stuff, those are the teams that are most successful with us, because we can't help you fix a problem if we don't know what it is. And if you come in every day saying, nope, everything's great, all going good, we got it, there's nothing Pi can do to help you other than give you a desk. So we really like the folks. I always feel like I'm finally breaking through that kind of founder veneer when somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I'm really having a problem with this. Or do you know anyone who knows about subject X, Y, or Z? And at that point in time, that's when the program's working at its best. And that's when the founder's at a level of engagement that's going to enable them to get the most out of the Pi program.
Yeah, and I love that. And you probably remember this, a couple of years when I started at Google, I tracked you down till we grabbed lunch, and I was like, Rick, I've never focused on Portland. What do I do? Who do I got to meet? I've never had a job really focused on our market.
Yeah.
But I think that network that's here is special.
Mm-hmm.
Last part of the interview, I want to move a little more personal.
Yeah.
You have a talent for connecting people. I saw your TED Talk, An Introvert's Guide to Networking.
Mm-hmm.
Shout out to your best friend, Golden Walnut.
Sitting right over there.
Where did that come from? I mean, how did you improve with that skill set? And would love to hear kind of your journey on that path.
Yeah. So for some additional context for folks, like, hey, if you want to watch that TED Talk, please, but I'll give you the Cliff's Notes version of it here. It's basically my role in the community is not necessarily anything I know. I don't have a great deal of expertise. I've been here so long, I just happen to know a lot of really awesome people who are very expert and knowledgeable in a variety of things. And so I spend a lot of my days meeting with new people and then saying, oh, you know who you need to talk to is this person, this person, this person, connecting those dots and letting it go from there. And I really enjoy doing that work. I think it's the nearest I can come to it is it's me actually putting my English degree to work, because it's just like plot development, right? Like it's like this character needs to meet that character and something interesting is going to happen. So I need to put those two people together, or I need this person to talk to all of these people, and just really seeing those potential opportunities for collaboration that may not be obvious to even the individuals themselves. And then the part that really truly humbles me the most about participating in that kind of community and that kind of network is the trust that those individuals actually have in me to see those potential opportunities. Like, I'm sure, yeah, I'm Ryan, I'm sure you've gotten some of them from me where you're like, I have no idea why Rick wants me to talk to this person, but if Rick says I should be talking to him, then I guess I'll talk to him. And having that level of trust and being able to have people just take that risk that I see some potential value in them connecting is really honestly the most rewarding and fulfilling part of the whole thing. And then later on, you know, I kind of had that, like, I don't remember everything, but I remember random facts or random things. And so knowing, like, 10 years later, seeing that those people that, and they probably don't even remember that I happened to connect them in the first place, but suddenly they're like working in a company together and they're building amazing stuff. And I'm like, well, maybe I had some part in that happening somewhere, you know, early on, and just remembering those moments where it's like, oh yeah, or going back through, I mean, thank you, Gmail. I use practically the same subject every time I introduce people. And so I can go back years and years and years and go, oh yeah, here's when I connected those two people who didn't know one another. Or, you know, when that company has an exit, I'd be like, how did I first meet that company and who introduced me to them? And so yeah, that kind of historical relevance of making those connections is something that's not lost on me either. And I'm really happy to be able to do some of that work for folks here in town.
Yeah, that's great. This next question, probably more for me than anyone else, but one I've been excited to ask you. How do you promote yourself or your brand in kind of this new digital age where folks are posting things everywhere? How do you promote yourself
Yeah.
authentically without being a jerk or feeling like a jerk or, you
Yeah.
know?
I mean, it's a great question. I think the a lot of the work I had done building my community and connections happened before any social networking stuff happened. So a lot of it I'm just dealing with based on a prior network. But the thing I discovered, the thing that honestly that Silicon Florist taught me that I hadn't realized was back in those days, you had a blog because you wanted to shout your personal opinion into the ether and you thought that you had some incredible insight about stuff that was happening. And um, you know, that kind of opinionated publishing never develops the kind of following that you hope for it to develop unless you are kind of like a self-promotional jerk and like really trying to work the system. But what I discovered from Silicon Florist is, you know, in my old blogs, when I would write a blog post, there was only one person interested in reading that blog post, and that was generally me. But when I took the opportunity like this to have a conversation with somebody else or to promote a product that somebody else was building or an event that somebody else was putting on, then suddenly I doubled my reader base at the very least, right? Because I was interested in reading that post, and the person I wrote about really felt validated by reading that post. And I think that that is the kind of magic and potential of social that a lot of which still seems to be stuck in that old blogging paradigm, right? Like you're on Facebook or Twitter, it's a lot of people just shouting into the ether about what they think and how the world should be. And if you just take a slight kind of tweak on that and start amplifying what others are saying, or you know, sharing Instagram photos in your story that other people have taken, then that's a really compelling way of not only providing value and exposure in a community, but also just validating the work that other people are doing and helping them feel that there's some you know, there's some benefit to the efforts they're putting into those kind of things. So I always encourage people, like, you should be retweeting more than you're tweeting, or you should be kind of like amplifying others more so than trying to get your more followers for you or whatever. And that seems to reciprocate, right? Like if you're often retweeting people that you respect and you like the way they write, or you're sharing their blog posts, or whatever, or thumbs upping their LinkedIn stuff, like that comes back around. Like people remember that stuff and start paying attention to what you're saying and what you're doing, and amplify your thoughts. So especially in communities that are collaborative like ours, that seems to be the easiest way to just kind of build up your presence in a community. And it takes, again, we've talked about it a couple times, but that kind of humility and empathy, and just kind of putting that into action. And it, at least around here, it seems to work. I don't know that it works everywhere, but it works around here.
Well, I just started my Twitter account, so I'm taking some notes.
Nice. Cool.
Do you got to jump, or you have time for a few more?
I've got time for a few more. Yeah.
Okay, great. So what advice do you have about networking for someone? I mean, going back to kind of your TED Talk,
Yep.
being an introvert, I'm someone who, if you don't know me pretty well, I kind of grew up very introverted, was very shy. What advice do you have for networking for someone who it doesn't come naturally to?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to kind of base this on Portland and kind of the culture here, because I think there's a slight kind of Portland hack that is not obvious. So the secret to networking in Portland is everybody is super accessible. So in some communities I've been to, you wind up, you have to go to networking event X and get so and so's business card, and then go through their people to arrange some meeting with them, likely at their office, and then it's a very short meeting, and it's a very slow kind of networking experience, where Portland kind of skips all that part of it. So the secret here is, if you hear of somebody interesting that you think you would like to talk to, like, just email them, or you know, like follow them on Twitter and start talking with them, or whatever. Because in Portland, 9 times out of 10, the response is like, yeah, sure, let's grab coffee. Like, I'm happy to talk to you, or let's jump on a Google Meet and talk about something. But if you don't know that, it's really confusing here, because there aren't big networking events, and there aren't those obvious ways of engaging with people. So here it's just trust that most of the folks I know either immediately respond to those things, or have specific time blocked out on their calendar where it's like, these 3 hours on a Thursday are reserved for random coffee meetings with people who reach out to me. And if you're not reaching out to them, you're not going to get on that schedule to have that meeting. And so that's the key to networking here. I think in some of the other locations, it's just kind of finding those key events that people are showing up to, and not that you even need to be participatory. It's just being there. It's just showing up and kind of being in the crowd can be beneficial. And then the other is, and Portland suffers from this. I think every community suffers from this. There's a real tendency for, once you've kind of established a presence, well, the community should come to me. Like, we're here, this is our office, we should bring everybody into our office. And I always encourage people to kind of like resist that urge, and still be like participating out in the community. Like, don't force the community to come to you. Go to where the community already is, and you're far more likely to develop strong network connections by taking the opportunity to show up elsewhere than you are by trying to bring people to you.
No, that's great. And I love your advice of kind of like, just go for it. I mean, you might fail, But
Yeah.
like with anything, like for me in any of my career, any of the things that I've started doing better, it's always started with failure and me not doing it right and figuring out what I can do better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's risky and it's scary, but um, Portland's very receptive to that kind of stuff. So again, that might not work in every community, but it seems to work here, and it's quite refreshing that it does, because that's how the community's been built by and large.
Yeah. So speaking of failure, where have you failed in your career? Any examples that you can think of, and what did you learn from the experience?
Um, yeah, I fail a ton. I fail in really small increments for the most part. Like I don't. I've always felt that pie is a bit of a failure in that we've never really hit upon a business model that works. Like we keep trying new ones, but that's somewhere I consistently fail. It's not as a like sustainable and resilient organization as I would like it to be, mostly because, like many folks in my position, I spend too much time working in the business rather than stepping back and working on the business, because I enjoy the work, and so don't focus the amount of time I should on building a great company. And that tends to be my most kind of consistent failure time and time again throughout my history. um, that was always my downfall, was like, I'm a good individual contributor, but I don't really think strategically. I appreciate strategy, and if I'm pushed, I can write strategy or conceive of strategy. But I find that my greatest failures come from when I'm trying to be the one who's the strategic visionary, and my greatest successes come when I am the tactical complement to a strategic visionary. So I've learned through those failures that I need to seek out those people who have a grand vision but may not know how to effectively implement it. And I need to be the person who's doing what are we doing in the next hour? What are we doing in the next day to get down that path on your vision?
That makes sense. Last couple of questions I have for you. You've openly talked about the importance of diversity.
Mhm.
Um, I'm half Hispanic. I think I've shared that with you.
Yep.
How do we continue to foster that in Portland, which historically hasn't had a ton of diversity,
Right.
and how can we encourage it?
Yeah, for folks who don't know, Portland is quite literally the whitest city in America. Um, I have heard folks reference that while it's exceptionally white, it's at least it's at least not as divided of a community. So, like in some city, like take Detroit, for example, if you're in a black neighborhood, you're probably not going to see any white people, and vice versa. Where in Portland, at least you see people who don't look like you, or don't share your lived experience. So that there's some nice interactions there. I think I think one of the challenges, I described it earlier, Portland doesn't grow very big companies. And I think part of that is some of the business focus, but I'm quite convinced that part of it is the lack of diversity. Like if you have a homogenous company of people who look like you, think like you, have shared your lived experience, then you can only come up with so many ideas. Like you need to introduce factors where people have a completely different perspective for you to truly think about new opportunities or innovative ideas or different ways of approaching problems. And so for me, diversity is a very specific business driver, right? Like the more diverse companies are statistically more successful. They do better as companies, and they're able to grow more effectively as companies. And so I think it's critical, rather than um, especially in the work we do, rather than saying, well, let's try and make this 500-person company more diverse when it's all a bunch of white dudes building software. That's a really hard problem. What if we start at the beginning and say, let's just build companies diverse from the ground up? And like, then that's part of the culture. And, you know, then it's not a matter of like reverse engineering your culture and your hiring practices and your sourcing practices to add more diversity. It's just something you've built in to the way that companies are built. I think that's the opportunity here. I think that's where we kind of need to do more work. And then the other part of it, I think that's really important is, you know, while internships are a valuable part of the ecosystem of starting to diversify companies, they're not a be all end all kind of thing. Like it's only a portion of what you need to be doing. So and I think one of the challenges with that is, again, if you have that 500-person company of all white dudes and you bring in a person of color or a woman of color, they don't see anybody who looks like them while they're in their internship. That's not going to feel like a terribly safe space or a thing they want to pursue if there's nobody that they can see as a mentor or a guide for them. So I think that's the other important part of it is identifying those those successful individuals who do have a different lived experience than folks, and ensuring that interns are getting the opportunity to work with them as well, or that people you're bringing in at an early stage have people who share their life experience or look like them at upper levels of the company as well. It's not just something you can do from the bottom up. It needs to happen all the way around.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and it's great insight. So last few, what's something that folks might not know about you outside of work?
Uh, I don't think people realize how much I like use cooking as a coping mechanism. Like that's my thing. Like cooking shows, me cooking myself, not baking, mind you. I'm horrible at baking, but like I really enjoy cooking and and being, experimental with that kind of stuff. Like we've done things where like here's a random box of ingredients, just figure out what you're going to make from that tonight and it better be good and stuff like that. And I really enjoy the creative process. If I get too English major about it, it's actually an analogy of how I connect people as well. It's just kind of like, well, I know these two flavors are supposed to go together, even though they exist in these things that you might not think of going together. But just trying to find those connection points where ingredients go together in a meaningful way, I find to be kind of really refreshing and kind of fills me up. Like I can be exhausted coming home from work or taking a break from work, and I can easily spend a couple hours at the stove just like mucking around and feeling totally refreshed. And I don't think many people know that about me unless they watch the random cooking shows we do on Snapchat or TikTok from time to time.
I was going to try to get through this whole interview without making this joke, but now pie all makes sense.
Yeah,
So,
see, it's all bad pie puns.
sorry,
Everything.
I tried. And quarantine questions.
Yeah.
Last one.
Yep.
Any books other than cooking books or shows or things that you've kept yourself busy with that you can share during this
Yeah.
time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been loading my list back up. So I had been going through a whole series of um, just kind of the history of venture capital and like the dynamics of venture capital. There's a really good compendium that's just called, I think it's just called VC, but it's the deep history of like where all of this came from and why the dynamics are the way they are. So it's almost like reading a baseball stats book about venture capital, which was a really interesting kind of tangent to go on for a while. One of the newest ones I've picked up is It's About Damn Time, Arlen Hamilton's new book. So I'm in the middle of that one. I've been looking at a couple other kind of community dynamic books. I think I'm having a hard time getting my head around how community works in this socially distanced world. And so I'm trying to kind of like think creatively about ways that the community might be able to engage and be built, even if we're not allowed to see one another face to face, or can't be at events or group environments. So I've started to do some thinking around that. But Arlen's book is a good quick read. Like if you're looking for a weekend book or something to pick up, I recommend that one. It's a good one.
Well, that's great. Well, Rick, want to thank you again for joining today.
Sure.
Again, very thankful for yourself, the work that you do for our community. If I'd like to learn more about that in Pi and some of that, where should I get started?
Yeah, you're always welcome to follow me on social. Unfortunately, it's Turoczy, which is not terribly easy to spell, but it's Turoc as in Charlie, Z as in zebra, Y on Twitter and Instagram and all of those. And then Pi, if you're interested in more on Pi, either look us up here on YouTube and you'll get kind of stories from our founders and mentors, or if you're more interested in the program itself, it is P as in Paul, IE, P as in Paul, D as in dog, X.com, PyPDX.com is the easiest place to find us. And that has links to all of our social and our GitHub repository and stuff too.
Great. Well, thanks again, Rick.
Of course.
Take care.
Thanks
Appreciate
for
it.
having me. Bye.